Thank you, Dom. It's a real pleasure to be here. And it's a particular pleasure to speak on such a thought-provoking theme, Trollope and women. It's a subject that takes us to the heart of what mattered most to his work and what still matters to his readers. But Trollope's thinking about women's lives was never straightforward, nor was it ever entirely fixed. His writing was shaped by a rapidly evolving cultural context, the people and the ideas that he met with, his experiences overseas, the social institutions he encountered, changing economic and political conditions. So I'm going to touch briefly on a whole range of themes that could be developed very much more fully, have been developed indeed by a number of critics. So my treatment of the theme will be in some ways very wide-ranging, but it won't reach as deep as it might do over some of the topics I'll touch on, but we might investigate a little further if we have time for questions at the end, as indeed I hope we will. One thing that is clear when we're thinking about Trollope and women is that no concern in Trollope's writing is distinct from other preoccupations. Trollope's perspectives on women are closely bound up with what he had to say about men and with his views on money, on work, on inheritance, on law, on Englishness, on rank and social class, on Ireland, on religion. Nothing is separate. That list of Trollope's themes has left out one that was fundamental from first to last, the family. And that's where I want to begin. In his private life, Trollope was a committed family man. And in his writing, the dynamics of the family are a persistent concern, particularly with regard to the relations between parents and children, which are often fractious in his novels and sometimes destructive. It's within Trollope's own experiences of the family that the deepest roots of his approach to what became known as the woman question can be traced. Now, as I'm sure you will all know, his early family life, as his autobiography and subsequent biographies make painfully clear, was difficult. Thomas Trollope, his father, was born into prosperity and the expectation of a substantial inheritance. He was a clever man, but he was both unlucky and inept in his professional life, failing as both a farmer and a barrister. The inheritance he'd been counting on came to nothing, leaving the family with serious financial problems. Thomas Trollope was also an aspiring but thwarted author. For years, he toiled on a massively ambitious Encyclopaedia Ecclesiastica, which was, as the title page of the first volume hubristically claimed, to provide a full and compendious explanation of all ecclesiastical rites and ceremonies, covering all denominations of Christians from the earlier stages of Christianity to the present time. It's an enterprise that sounds a bit like Casaubon's Key to All Mythologies in Middlemarch. Trollope's autobiography describes how his father worked at his most ungrateful task with unflagging industry. Unsurprisingly, only the first volume ever published in 1834, which, to be fair, was more than Casaubon ever managed. Now, the contrast with the literary career of Trollope's mother, Frances Trollope, Fanny, could not have been more marked. Fanny became a prolific and successful author, and it was her work, beginning with the entertainingly scathing and very popular 1832 book on the domestic manners of the Americans, Still a rousing read, I may say, that went some way towards rescuing the family from financial disaster. Fanny published 6 travel books and 35 novels, 35 over the course of her long life, having started at the age of 50. Not to mention numerous journaling articles and poetry. These are facts which make some of us, I speak of myself here, wonder quite what we have done with our lives. On the other hand, perhaps there's hope for us all. Like her husband, though much more fruitfully, she stuck to her task in the most unpropitious circumstances. Her son, Anthony, famously would rise to sit at his desk at 5 o'clock in the morning, but Fanny, it seems, would get up at 4. Why? Not simply to make a name for herself, though she certainly did that, but because her work was necessary. Trollope recalls her labours in his autobiography with wonder and admiration. After the family fled from creditors to Belgium, disaster followed disaster. Trollope's brother Henry was succumbing to tuberculosis, and his father's life was also fading. I quote, this is from the autobiography, "From that time forth, my mother's most visible occupation was that of nursing. There were 2 sick men in the house, and hers were the hands that tended them." The novels went on, of course. We had already learned to know that they would be forthcoming at stated intervals, and they always were forthcoming. The doctor's vials and the ink bottle held equal places in my mother's rooms. I have written many novels under many circumstances, but I doubt much whether I could write one when my whole heart was by the bedside of a dying son. This formidably disciplined model was crucial to Trollope's formation, but Trollope was keen to emphasize that his mother did not relinquish her womanly duties to pursue her career as an author, nor did she abandon her sense of social responsibility. In 1836, she published a very early anti-slavery novel, Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw, which was an influence on Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her Michael Armstrong, Factory Boy, published in 1840, was equally pioneering as an industrial novel. Relations between Fanny and Anthony were not always straightforward or always warm, but she earned his respect by managing to sustain multiple identities as a devoted wife and mother and a commercially successful and socially engaged writer. In looking for the origins of Trollope's ambitions and identity as a writer, we don't have to look far. They came from a woman, his mother. Fanny Trollope had 7 children, and 5 of them died in her lifetime. 2 sons survived her, Anthony and his older brother Tom, and they both became exceptionally prolific writers. Cecilia, Trollope's sister, who died of tuberculosis at the age of 32, was, like her mother, a devoted wife who bore 5 children. And it's worth noting that it was Cecilia who was the first of Fanny's children to bring out a novel, Chollerton, an unremittingly dogmatic tractarian tale which appeared anonymously in 1846. Tom Trollope also wrote novels, though he saw himself primarily as a scholar and historian. Tom's early career was launched on the strength of his mother's reputation. Having abandoned his work as a school teacher in order to become Fanny's companion and agent, his first travel books referred to Fanny on their title pages and found publishers through her connections, as indeed did Anthony's first novels. Tom published 60 books in all. Again, I'm staggered by these numbers. I just don't know how they did it, really. 60 books. And there was a friendly rivalry between him and Anthony as to who could write most. But neither of them could match the unstoppable Fanny Trollope, who brought out more than 100 volumes before she died in 1863. The Trollopes were indeed a writing family. Fanny Trollope was its foundation. That remarkable example lies behind, I would argue, lies behind much of Trollope's divided thinking about women and their place in the world. What should a woman do with her life? My title is taken from Can You Forgive Her?, the first of Trollope's Palliser novels, published in 1865. I will guess that you all know the story. Alice Vavasor is engaged to the honourable, but perhaps rather overbearing, John Grey, but is considering throwing Grey over in order to marry her evidently unreliable cousin, George Vavasor. How has this happened? Alice has no mother to advise her, though it might not have helped much if she had. The stiffly conservative Lady Macleod is no substitute. Her father, John Vavasor, is one of Trollope's legion of utterly ineffectual men who wastes his time shuttling between his club and a futile office job. His empty existence is a telling example of what a man should not do with his life. Alice wants something better for herself, a role with substance and meaning, preferably in the political sphere. What should a woman do with her life? Trollope goes on to describe Alice's uncertainty. I quote, "There had arisen around her a flock of learned ladies asking that question, to whom it seems that the proper answer has never yet occurred. Fall in love, marry the man, have 2 children, and live happy ever afterwards. I maintain that answer has as much wisdom in it as any other that can be given, or perhaps more. The advice contained in it cannot perhaps always be followed to the letter, but neither can the advice of the other kind, which is given by the flock of learned ladies who ask the question." Now, this is dispiriting, and it might well be argued that the trajectory of the plot, in which Alice has much to endure from George's unprincipled behaviour, and finally marries John Grey after all, is also dispiriting. But Trollope is on Alice's side, as he very often is on the side of his female characters. There is never any doubt about the answer his readers are expected to give to the question in his novel's title, nor is there any doubt about the degree of sympathy with which we are asked to identify with Alice's confused struggles. The reader is clearly expected to forgive Alice, just as we are expected to forgive Glencora, the lively duchess whose dissatisfaction with her privileged but unfulfilled life also leads to a reckless bid for escape that nearly brings her to shipwreck. Can You Forgive Her is an example of the ambivalent thinking that lies behind much of Trollope's treatment of women from his own class, ladies, in other words. Women who are not ladies were always a different matter. He knew what women were capable of achieving, not least in his own professional field of fiction. He'd seen that in his mother's productive life and in the lives of other women writers of the period. Margaret Oliphant, Elizabeth Gaskell, George Eliot. Female authors of sensation novels like Ellen Wood or Rhoda Broughton proved that they could, perhaps disconcertingly, as far as Trollope was concerned, they could achieve popular success on a level with his own. Despite his disparaging comment about the flock of learned ladies, he'd been impressed by the arguments of feminists, including American feminists that he'd met. The example of Kate Field, the resolutely independent American woman who became an important presence in his life, could not be easily dismissed. Trollope certainly admired Kate, and perhaps he loved her. And yet he couldn't let go of his conviction that women's primary purpose lay in her domestic identity, her work as a wife and mother. And he urged Kate to marry, which she never did. His own mother had balanced different identities, and that precedence lingers in his thought. I've noted the interconnectedness of that thought, and I want to turn now to the link between the broader context of Trollope's political disposition and the complexities of his position with regard to women. Trollope famously declared in his autobiography that he was an advanced but still a conservative liberal, and much careful critical thought has recently been devoted to the question of what in practice that might mean in terms of his affiliation to the political movements of his circle, the texture of his prose, or his relations with empire. There's a long list of critics, including Amanda Anderson, Lauren Goodlad, Elaine Hadley, Frederick Van Dam, Uday Mehta, Helen Small. They've all contributed to debates centred on Trollope's liberalism, arguing that the legacies of liberal identity might still inform our contemporary political understanding as we explore its shifting forms through the decades of high Victorian liberalism. In Trollope's case, the ambiguities and tensions within liberalism interact with the ambivalence of his views on the social identity of women to create uncertainties that call for the active participation and judgment of readers. Our role is not a passive one. We're given questions and must try to answer them. What should a woman do with her life? Much of this uncertainty turns on his handling of the courtship plot, always a mainstay of his narratives. Trollope is, as many have observed, surprisingly open about the sexual feeling that should accompany successful partnerships between young men and women, alongside the necessary integrity of commitment and, of course, the necessary calculations as to income, always a present concern in Trollope's mind. In Can You Forgive Her, he claims that women, Alice in this instance, are inclined to overthink their marriage choices, that a girl should really love the man she intends to marry. That, at any rate, may be admitted. But love generally comes easily enough. With all her doubts, Alice never doubted her love for Mr. Grey, nor did she doubt his character, nor his temper, nor his means. But she had gone on thinking of the matter till her mind had become filled with some undefined idea of the importance to her of her own life. Thinking, it seems, is not what is needed. Trollope claims that, I quote, "I do not know that a woman can assure to herself by her own prudence and taste a good husband any more than she can add 2 cubits to her statue. But husbands have been made to be decently good, and wives too, for the most part, in our country, so that the thing does not require quite so much thinking as some people say. And yet the commitment's evidently a serious matter, particularly for women. There's rarely any going back. Broadly speaking, with few exceptions, once a woman has given her heart away in Trollope's fiction, it is gone for good. She cannot love again. If she betrays that crucial first commitment, prompted by social ambition, she will destroy her chance of happiness. If her lover betrays it, she will rarely find fulfillment in marriage. Lady Mabel Grex fails in her plan to rescue the family's fortune by marrying the wealthy Lord Silverbridge in The Duke's Children. She faces a desolate future, as does the widowed Laura Kennedy in Phineas Redux. These capable women pay the price for what, in Trollope's terms, is the fundamental error of prioritizing money, status, or the opportunity for political engagement rather than following their hearts. Mabel had been in love with Frank Tregear, while Laura had loved Phineas Finn. Both of these men find emotional fulfillment and financial security in advantageous marriages elsewhere. Trollope believed that men could usually love again, but women in his fiction usually can't. The pattern is repeated with variations throughout Trollope's fiction. Julia Brabazon, who marries a dissolute aristocrat rather than her beloved Harry Clavering in The Claverings, is another telling example. Harry eventually marries the worthy, if somewhat insipid, Florence Burton, who has been waiting faithfully throughout his weak-willed vacillations. Harry makes the honourable choice, but the reader's left in no doubt that the bereft Julia is stronger, more intelligent, and more interesting than her lover or her blameless rival. But then women who do commit themselves to the men they love are by no means guaranteed contentment. Emily Wharton's defiance in marrying Ferdinand Lopez in The Prime Minister, despite the uncertainty surrounding his origins, leads only to the miserable disgrace arising from her husband's opportunistic ambition. Emily Rowley, in He Knew He Was Right, seems to have behaved properly in marrying the respectable Louis Trevelyan. But Trevelyan's irrational jealousy drives him insane, and Emily's happiness is wrecked. In Lady Anna, the nobly born Anna stands by her commitment to marry Daniel Thwaite, the radical tailor, in the face of formidable opposition. Her loyal resolution is seen to be commendable, but Daniel's dour nature, coupled with his disconcerting insistence on retaining complete control of Anna's money, doesn't bode entirely well for her happiness with her husband in their new life in Australia. Women are repeatedly seen to be vulnerable in these situations, and Trollope, presenting their inability to transfer their affection to an alternative lover, is fundamentally on their side, just as he is on Alice Vavasor's side in Can You Forgive Her? His sympathies, his deepest sympathies, consistently lie with those who find that they cannot change or will not change. Their allegiance is rooted, fortunately or unfortunately, in memory and the past. And yet, he recognises the emotional and practical entrapment this can lead to, and acknowledges the benefits of change, or sometimes the need to change. In The Small House at Allington, it would have been better for Lily Dale to transfer her love for Adolphus Crosby to the very much more deserving Johnny Eames, but she can't do it. Johnny is a rarer example of a man who cannot change, for he is unable to move on from his first commitment to Lily. Loyalty is a key term here in Trollope's perception of sexual politics, as often in his understanding of national politics. Silverbridge's disloyalty to his family's liberal principles, and particularly to his father's high-minded example in that is Silverbridge's flirtation with conservatism in the Duke's Children, is evidently a mistake on two levels. His return to the liberal fold is a return to right-thinking political values, but it's also a return to emotional integrity and the inherited family values that accompany Trollope's definition of political wholeness. There is a deep, if incomplete, consonance between Trollope's views on gender and his political identity. Both are grounded in the social conservatism that qualifies his commitment to liberalism. But this is to assume that the division between men and women, or male and female, is absolute. And in Trollope's fiction, this is not always the case. Gendered identities and roles are sometimes unstable. He heartily disapproves of women who deliberately plan to blur them, attempting to usurp roles that should, in his view, properly belong to men. Mrs. Proudie's damaging domination of her husband is an eloquent example of this disapproval on Trollope's part, as is the self-interested behaviour of Mrs. Wilkinson, the mother of the clergyman, Arthur Wilkinson, in The Bertrams, who has come to see herself as the rightful incumbent of her son's parish. Similarly, he has little time for assertive feminists, like the heavily satirised Baroness Banmann in Is He Popenjoy? Other gendered fluidities, however, are more subtly and positively presented in Trollope's fiction. The hunting field is one arena where Trollope allows an experimental challenge to conventional constructions of gender. A woman may ride as hard as a man, as he notes approvingly in his 1865 hunting sketches. How pleasant it is, I quote, how pleasant it is to see her in her pride of place, achieving her mastery, an interesting word there, her mastery over the difficulties in her way by her own wit, as all men and all women also must really do who intend to ride to hounds, and doing it all without any sign that the difficulties are too great for her. Hunting had been considered an unseemly activity for ladies in the early decades of the 19th century, but it became more permissible in the 1850s, partly, in fact, as a result of the development of better and safer side saddles. As so often, technology is a friend to women. In the 1860s, it was a fashionable activity. Mrs. Spooner, who is a woman completely and slightly absurdly devoted to the sport, is an example of a woman who's found social and physical freedom in pursuit of the fox. She's a largely comic character in Phineas Redux, but in the Duke's Children, she's grown into a more impressive figure. Silverbridge, at any rate, is impressed and his encounters with Mrs. Spooner are part of his education with regard to women's capacities that we witness as they unfold in that novel. Readers are given to understand that Mrs. Spooner knows the business of hunting better than any man in the field, and she generously helps Silverbridge when he falls. A subsequent exchange between Silverbridge and the largely unlikable Frank Tregear, here I reveal my own view, is revealing. Silverbridge asks Tregear, "I wonder what you'll think of Mrs. Spooner," he said. "Why should I think anything of her?" "Because I doubt whether you ever saw such a woman before. She does nothing but hunt. Then I certainly shan't want to see her again. And she talks as I never heard a lady talk before. Then I don't care if I never see her at all. But she is the most plucky and good-natured human being I ever saw in my life." Silverbridge is seen in a better light than Tregear here. His appreciation of Mrs. Spooner's positive qualities is a sign of his growing maturity. In general, wives who earn Trollope's approval are content to concede primacy to their husbands, but not always. Mrs. Spooner is much cleverer than her husband, not a difficult feat, and manages his interests. Archdeacon Grantley is a traditionally conservative figure in the Barchester novels, but he's often prepared to be guided by his ever-sensible wife. I quote, "It arose that our Archdeacon listened to the counsels of his wife, though he considered himself entitled to give counsel to every other being whom he met." Phineas Finn is rescued from a charge of murder by the determined efforts of Mary Goesler, who is evidently not destined to be an entirely meek and submissive wife in their subsequent marriage. Arabella Greenough will clearly be in charge of her needy husband, Captain Belfield, after their marriage in Can You Forgive Her? Having witnessed the marriage of his parents, Trollope was fully aware that the balance of power within apparently conventional marriages could sometimes tilt in a wife's direction, and that this could be wholesome for the husband as well as for the wife. And heterosexual partnerships were not the only possible option in Trollope's fiction. The critic Kate Flint's work on Queer Trollope has pointed to a number of partnerships or potential partnerships between women. Kate Vavasor's attachments to her brother George and to her cousin Alice in Can You Forgive Her?, a novel which is particularly concerned with exploring a variety of women's social roles, seems warmer than and more, sometimes more passionate than any other relationship in the novel. Kate is clearly not inclined to marry, nor is Priscilla Stanbury in He Knew He Was Right, a novel that, we can agree, can hardly be seen as a wholehearted advertisement for marriage. Priscilla Stanbury says, "I'm often cross, and I like my own way, and I have a distaste for men. I never in my life saw a man whom I wished even to make my intimate friend." The fervour of the feminist Wally Petrie's attachment to her younger friend Caroline, the beloved of her heart, since Caroline Spaulding was a very little girl, suggests that Wally too may not be in the market for marriage. Examples of such non-normative sexual identities are not confined to women. In The Warden and elsewhere in the Barchester novels, the mild Septimus Harding is a touchstone of virtue, and Trollope suggests that his quality of soft, womanly affection is essential to his goodness. Other major and minor characters obliquely signal homosexuality, like Mr. Moffat in Dr. Thorne, with his pretty mincing voice. More unexpectedly, Phineas Finn, who is clearly not homosexual, responds to his dramatic reprieve from the gallows with an emotional collapse that seems to undermine his conventional masculinity. He has learned a hard lesson, one that has marked the education of Trollope's women since earliest childhood, that he is not in control of his own destiny. He retreats from society and political ambition deserts him. Lord Chiltern, urging him to pull himself together, told him plainly that he was weak and womanly, or rather that he would be, were he to continue to dread the faces of his fellow creatures. "I am womanly," said Phineas. "I begin to feel it, but I can't alter my nature." But this honesty, Trollope goes on to claim, is in fact where Phineas's true manliness is to be identified. Artifice and affectation, that staring, posed, bewhiskered and bewigged deportment that claims the privileges of a man without his proper virtues, were, as Trollope understood matters, corrupting the authentic masculine ideal. The political world of Westminster was exclusively male. But just as women were choosing to encroach on masculine territory, misguidedly in Trollope's view, the theatre of the House of Commons showed signs of contamination from a false model of femininity. The well-preserved Sir Timothy Beeswax, unprincipled Conservative leader of the House of Commons, is not above cosmetic aids. Trollope comments, "Of course, it is all paint. But how would the poor girl look before the gaslights if there were no paint?" The House of Commons likes a little deportment on occasions. Trollope doesn't altogether approve. "It's good to be beautiful," he observes, "but it should come of God and not of the hairdresser." But he knows that such quasi-feminine strategies have their effects. I quote, "Sir Timothy probably knew what he was about and did himself, on the whole, more good than harm by his little tricks." For good or ill, the gendered identity of men and women was porous. What should a woman do with her life? For all his brisk recommendation that we should not overthink the matter, Trollope thought about it a good deal, and his thinking shapes his fiction. But he came to no absolute conclusions. His instincts were inclined to the traditional social order, in which women should aspire to marry and bear children, and men should also wish to marry and establish families. Much of the substance of his narratives has to do with the obstacles and difficulties that lay in the path of achieving that desirable outcome. And yet, those instincts don't have everything their own way. Women, Trollope saw, understood increasingly as he aged, women were fit for other destinies and other kinds of work. And Trollope understood more and more clearly that the barriers that prevented their participating more actively in public life were unjust. And Trollope had a very strong sense of justice. There were double standards, and women were damaged by them. His fiction repeatedly makes these points, directly or indirectly, in ways that continue to engage the judgment and imagination of his readers. I've touched on some of them, but as I said in beginning this talk, there's very much more to be said. Not all of the questions that define Trollope's writing are to be simply answered, and this is certainly one of them. What indeed should a woman do with her life? Thank you.